Mike, is it like Christmas morning for you at this point? I just like, let's just begin there.
Yeah, it's uh it's a new day in America and it feels something like a Christmas morning. I think you did an amazing job teeing this up. There's really by describing it as a fake world, I've been using this phrase USAID Truman Show about the USAID debacle that's been unfolding over the past several months. And I've been trying to stress that USAID is the continuation of CIA work, and that after the CIA got in trouble in the 1960s and 70s and had to go through these reforms, they moved the operational layer of the CIA substantially into USAID. You have in these papers the direct, you see this phrase agency sponsored time and time again, and that these were all largely redacted. They'll reference some group, the Hungarian Freedom Fighters, or some research center in Houston, Texas, and then there'll be brackets. There were brackets up until for the past 50 years, and now we see the brackets visible, and it'll say, and they're agency sponsored. At the time, that meant Central Intelligence Agency. Now, by and large, that means the U.S. Agency for International Development, and it's simply done as a democracy promotion program rather than a covert action program that has to be authorized by the White House. And if I can just point out a few things up top that I find so fascinating about these documents, is really I'm less interested as I am in the JFK assassination. I had no expectations of finding some singular smoking gun within the agency's own files that said, well, we did it. But what you see is just an incredible trove of structuring and internal deliberation documents that live on today because the institutions that are named and the dynamics that they were dealing with are infused in like the current dramas that we're currently involved in. So, for example, there's this 15-page Arthur Schlesinger memo that's a lot of folks are talking about, and I too find it incredibly fascinating. And it's called CIA Reorganization. And even that name, when you, again, as we've talked about so many times, in today's context, when it's too dirty for the CIA, it's done by USAID, and USAID is going through a reorganization. There has been an incredible push and pull drama that's been playing out over this, as the White House has been trying to shut USAID down. And then the courts just this very week said, actually, you can't shut it down. You have to keep spending $44 billion of U.S. taxpayer money in foreign countries. The president can't stop it, even though the president set it up. Which president? It was JFK. JFK set it up in 1961, set up USAID. And actually, maybe there are two things that are related on this topic. There's this Arthur Schlesinger memo. This one, CIA Reorganization. And if you there's a passage in there that's called Confidential American Sources. And what Schlesinger goes over is how the CIA is supposed to answer to the State Department. The State Department's supposed to be the big Mac Daddy when it comes to foreign policy. And all these different spindle groups like the CIA, like Voice of America, like what would come to be USAID, they're supposed to answer to state. State is supposed to have review and approval authority. The CIA is supposed to provide covert assistance. And what Schlesinger says in this memo is that we need to reorganize the CIA because they effectively are dominating many aspects of foreign policy, that they're supposed to be receiving our instructions. Instead, they're pursuing their own foreign policy, and we end up just rubber stamping everything with very little transparency into what's going on there. Note that that's the same thing that Senator Joni Ernst complained to Elon Musk about on a live X space, that the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, was never able to get access to what USAID was really doing. We saw the Obama administration complain about that with the Zunzuneo fake Cuban Twitter affair that evidently happened without presidential or White House approval. We saw that happen with the State Department complaining that they had little effective oversight over USAID. And what you see in this document is they actually go through the specific structure through which the CIA is able to end run the State Department. And they talk about how the CIA abused State Department cover constantly. It's if you go down, I think it's section 3, if you can pull it up. It's a section right below this. It's section 3 called the Controlled American Sources. I think it should just be on the next page if you pull it up on screen.
Yep. We're getting it. Yep.
Yep. And what they go over is, a lot of people have accused me of being CIA because I had this tenure at State, and the most common cover for CIA is State. State is by far and away the most common. State Department attaché is sort of like a CIA meme. And yes, so starting there, this whole section, it says the controlled American sources represent a particular aspect of CIA's encroachment on policymaking functions. CIA and there's a deceptive subtlety to this phrase policymaking functions right there at the bottom. This is super important because the president is supposed to set foreign policy and if there's a rogue cell that's using American taxpayer dollars, American direct personnel or informants or agents or networks to carry out a foreign policy that's in opposition to what the president wants, that is a massive impact on world affairs. You can imagine, for example, if Trump wants peace in Ukraine, but there's a rogue cell out of the U.S. Embassy in Kiev that does not want peace in Ukraine, and they operationalize the network that is supposed to be instrumentalized by the U.S. president and its policy-making function, then world history plays out in a completely different manner. And so what it says is, right, the encroachment on policy-making functions. CIA today has nearly as many people under official cover overseas at State, 3,900 to 3,700. About 1,500 of them are under State Department cover. Now, I knew that there was this massive overrepresentation of cover under State Department cloak. I didn't have the specific numbers until 2 days ago. Roughly half of all CIA agents undercover overseas are under State Department cover, and then the other 2,200 are either under military or non-state cover. Non-state will mean through. At that point, it would be the NGOs, the universities, commercial cover is a big one. But it says originally the use of State Department cover for CIA personnel was supposed to be strictly limited and temporary. This is fascinating to see, by the way, that this was 1961. They were already complaining. The pinned video at the top of my X feed goes through this State Department CIA creation in 1948. But to see that only 13 years later, the State Department was openly complaining that the Frankenstein monster they'd created had already, effectively usurped so much of that function. But if you go back to that page there, it says, so the Dulles-Jackson report in 1948, the CIA should not use State Department cover as a simple answer to all of its problems, but should proceed to develop its own outside cover. And eventually, in this way, and through increased efficiency, find ways to temper its demands on the State Department. Nonetheless, it steadily increased its requisitions for official cover. And then it says there's several reasons why they do it. It's quicker, it's less expensive, it leads to more secure communications because it's all happening within the embassy. It's a pleasanter life for CIA people. But then it says in some missions, I understand, that these CIA folks under State Department cover personnel outnumbers regular State Department personnel. In the American Embassy in Vienna, out of the 20 persons listed as being in the political section, so that's influencing the political affairs, the State Department has a political affairs branch. That was actually Victoria Nuland's job, interestingly enough. Victoria Nuland, after she was the head of European and Eurasian affairs during the Maidan coup. She was promoted to the head of the whole political section at the State Department. Now we learn that basically the entire political section in virtually every embassy is 3/4 CIA. And I'll talk about how that, I know that that's continued at least up until the 2000s, but I'm just going to read a little bit of this. And by the way, Victoria Nuland, after her term at state, moved to be on the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the world's most prolific CIA cutout, which was conceived of in the office of the CIA in 1983. So you see this CIA role for Victoria Nuland just jumping off the page here. But you see, as it says, in Vienna, of the 20 persons who were listed in the political section, 16 of them, so that is 80% of the State Department folks there are actually CIA. In Chile, it's 13 of the 31. 47% of the political officers serving in U.S. embassies on the day of Kennedy's inauguration were actually CIA. Sometimes the CIA mission chief is actually working directly at the embassy. We saw this. I'll talk about when I get to the John Brennan lead up to this, how that actually happened in the lead up to 9/11. But it says then sometimes he actually has a different policy than that of the CIA, of the ambassador, the CIA mission chief. And in the Paris embassy today, now that was a friendly country, was in 1961. There are 128 CIA people working out of the Paris embassy. CIA in Paris has long begun to move into areas of political reporting normally occupied by state. The CIA men doing overt internal political reporting outnumber those in the embassy's political section. It's even sought to monopolize contact with certain French personalities, among them the president of the National Assembly, their parliament. CIA occupies the top floor of the Paris embassy, a fact well known locally. And if you juxtapose that against another fantastic document, which is from the CIA side of this, the Alan Dulles side of this, and I can see if I can pop it up to you guys on screen for a second here. There's a document that references the necessity of avoiding higher approval and the quote NSC machinery. And if I can just take 1 second here to just pull the reference.
All
right.
The deep dive, Mike, is always fun with you, man.
Yes,
you always
likewise.
pull things out that virtually everybody else misses. And you've seen the inside of the machine, right? You've been at state, so you've seen just even the top layer of crust of this monster.
Well, because that's what you do at state. At state, you can request a CIA analyst memo. I could request the CIA to write a memo. They're supposed to serve state. But what's okay, so I just texted this to your producer, and I can text it to you directly too. You can find, Mario has a tweet with the specific screenshots, and I can pull the ID number if you need it on it. But I can just describe it in general form here.
Yep, I got it.
Which is in June 1961, there's a special group that's set up that is effectively a NSC interagency, a National Security Council interagency group meeting. They call it the special group. And I believe if you scroll down to look at the screenshots, I can walk you through it. But again, this is June 1961, just 5 months before before USAID was created, because USAID was created in the thick of all of these disputes between Kennedy, his CIA, his National Security Council, and what it goes through here is, you see it says review of political action projects. And this is a special group, and you see it says that it's got Alan Dulles as well as the special assistant to the president, JFK. And you'll see at the top it says in Congo that the approval for the CIA work there was conditioned on the acceptance of 3 provisions set forth in the State Department internal memo. So the CIA wants to do this work, but the State Department saying you can only do it on the following three conditions, and that Mr. Bundy felt that he could not approve this program without reference to higher authority, which is going to mean the National Security Council, which is the White House interagency, because there are all these levels of control when it comes to this dirty work that's supposed to rein it in. It's all supposed to run through the president. The president sets the foreign policy of the country. The State Department's supposed to carry that out. The CIA is supposed to carry out the dirty work on behalf of the State Department. So you have these levels. And the accountability of the CIA and the accountability of state are both supposed to happen at the National Security Council, which is parked in the White House layer. So if you go to the next page is where it gets really spicy and interesting. Okay, so it says that Mr. Dulles, that was the head of the CIA, noted that the pertinent National Security Council, NSC paper, authorized programs, but emphasized that they would only undertake this type of activity if it was fully supported by the Department of State and higher authority, meaning the National Security Council. And then it says that Mr. Dulles said, however, that he felt the special group should have some latitude to make decisions on these matters within the general policy, which might be laid down by the higher authority without referral of each specific case for approval. So what Dulles is campaigning for at this time, this is 5 months before USAID is created, is that the CIA should not need detailed oversight of every specific operation or every specific contracting agent that they work with, or the methods through which they carry it out. What they want is a general policy articulated. Regime change in Nicaragua, the sabotage of a pipeline in Siberia, but not have to have the specific means and methods approved because it's leading to delays in operational approval, which then sabotages the ability to actually get the operation done and carry out the general foreign policy. And then if you scroll down, if you go to the Vietnam section here, and again, Vietnam was a huge dispute with JFK. There are many people who believe that part of the CIA relations with CIA's role in the JFK assassination may have to do with the conflict over what to do in Vietnam and what to do vis-a-vis Russia. But you see, it says covert annex Korea. And we had just come out of the Korean War at this point, and we are still very active in the region with Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. It says Mr. Bundy reiterated the decision that covert annexes should not be processed through the National Security Council machinery, because in the interest of higher authority and political action operations, that's manipulating the internal politics in friendly areas. So again, this is in friendly areas, in partnered countries. We should not run the political manipulation that we do through the, quote, NSC machinery. Now, I'm going to juxtapose this with a document that came out in 2014. The USAID had begun working more and more directly with the U.S. military and special forces. Special forces is the specific branch of the U.S. military that does political black ops in the name of national security. So there's this deep interlinkage between Pentagon special forces, CIA covert action, and USAID, who sets up and funds all the different assets and institutions under humanitarian cover, under media cover, under NGO cover in the region that special forces will work with and CIA will work with to carry out those political black ops, whether they help national interest, that's where you get CIA, or national security, that's where you get special forces. And there's a great document from 2014 that was set up to review the efficacy of USAID, DOD joint work. There was a special bureau that was set up during the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton helped facilitate that while she was Secretary of State to join USAID to the Pentagon directly. Hillary Clinton called this the 3Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. Joining together the Pentagon, the State Department, and USAID. And there's a direct quote from one of the generals who was commissioned to help review the efficacy. And what the general said is, at this point in time, this was 2014, that the U.S. military prefers to work directly with USAID rather than with the State Department, because USAID actually does stuff, and USAID is not handcuffed by what he called the knife fight at the interagency level, meaning that because USAID does not have to get NSC approval, it does not have to be run through the NSC machinery, the Pentagon can run its own foreign policy in the area without having to deal with the negotiation with the White House. And this is actually the origins of the term the blob. This is not my coinage. This was the Obama National Security Council's coinage. The Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, is who coined that term, the blob, because he felt the Obama administration could not even really set foreign policy because they were being end run by the different levels, like the Defense Department and like the USAID-funded NGO Plex that could effectively carry out their own foreign policy in the region, and the NSC could not fully control them. And what you see here is a deliberate plot by the CIA in 1961 to cause that problem, to actually, and what's so amazing about it is just 5 months in that memo, they reference how Allen Dulles was then about to meet directly with the White House to try to set up a plan to carry this out. And lo and behold, 5 months later, USAID is created, and USAID is not on the National Security Council. It's completely off channel to the White House in that respect. It's supposed to answer to the State Department. But the fact is there's no oversight. If the Inspector General doesn't inform, then they can carry out their own foreign policy. And you see right here that USAID is exactly what the CIA was asking for, a method to have a general policy in the region, a carte blanche effectively beyond that, so that if, for example, the president sets a policy that they want to wipe out Al-Qaeda, but the CIA doesn't want to do that, the Pentagon doesn't want to do that, they can say, okay, we're taking on ISIS, but in the background, they can be funneling arms and running funds and shelter and healthcare and technical support, just in that process without ever having to inform the White House. We saw this happen to President Trump when USAID was funding these very terrorist groups Trump was trying to wipe out. We saw this happen with the military openly bragging shortly after Trump lost the election that they were, quote, constantly playing shell games with the numbers that were happening in terms of the number of troops in Syria, the number of troops in Iraq, while Trump was trying to scale down. Those numbers could have been, they were giving them the official W-2 employees and not reporting, how many people there were under military cover or how many assets there were not being reported because they were simply not conveyed to the White House. But what I'm trying to say here is that document's called CIA reorganization. What are we going through right now? USAID reorganization. And by the way, that's not an accident. The first thing USAID did after it got set up was provide funding to these CIA-backed mercenary groups in Laos and Cambodia. There's the famous case I've talked about Vang Pao in Cambodia, which was in 1961, November 1961, USAID gets created. Just 2 weeks earlier, JFK had awarded the Green Beret to the Special Forces. Again, the Special Forces do this political work, this in the name of national security. They will influence internal politics in order to get a military base installed, in order to promote paramilitary groups that might unseat that government who's doing political stuff that the White House nominally doesn't like. But just 1 month after USAID was created, JFK launched something called Operation Pincushion in Cambodia, which was a special forces mission to recruit. And you can look this up. It's called Operation Pincushion. That was in December 1961, just 1 month after USAID was created. Operation Pincushion was a special forces operation to recruit violent terrorist groups and paramilitaries as hillside guerrillas in Cambodia. They could not get enough funding for Operation Pincushion directly through congressional appropriations, and so they set up a drug trade in Cambodia. They had the CIA then took control of the Special Forces recruits. It was a CIA-backed mercenary group. This has all come out, by the way, in the Senate Intelligence Committee. The John Kerry hearings, by the way. John Kerry was involved in this in the 1970s. And USAID quickly took up the task within a few years of providing the financing to the CIA-backed CIA mercenary army. The USAID even paid for Vang Pao's CIA army to purchase 2 CIA proprietary aircraft, one from Air America, one from Continental Air Services. These have both been declassified. They're in historical museums. They're on CIA.gov as being stipulated CIA proprietary airlines. They were known to be trafficking the heroin from the Golden Triangle in Cambodia to Vietnam to retail the heroin for profit so that they could pay for their arms, they could pay for the mercenaries. And so the USAID was buying CIA airlines within just a few years of its creation. And then this became a big scandal in the 1970s in the lead up to the Church Committee hearings. Professor Alfred McCoy actually, testified to this in 1972 to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But JFK might not have known that we were trafficking drugs out of that's what USAID and CIA were doing, because all this could occur without having to go through the NSC machinery. What Trump is trying to do fundamentally right now is run foreign policy out of the White House, as was supposed to be the case in 1948, in 1961. These very institutions under the gun for potentially assassinating JFK were Trump is trying to do now what JFK tried to but failed to do in 1961. And the final thing I'll say as a volley here is I had a weird personal experience with this when I was a White House speechwriter, because I was a speechwriter for Trump in what feels like an eternity ago now. But I had a weird assignment once where I was asked to look up the quotes that JFK had to say about his own military generals, and to potentially fold that into a speech, because at the time in 2020, Trump was concerned that his own military was betraying him behind his back and was curious about JFK experiencing the same problems and what JFK had to say about the Pentagon not running things through the National Security Council channels. The Pentagon is supposed to answer to the National Security Council, just like state, just like CIA. And so in so many ways, there is this mere reflection of Trump in the JFK assassination story. And what we're seeing now is sort of a second shot at the apple.
I mean, a literal second shot at the apple, because there are so many parallels here that it's bone chilling. Also, I just want to establish, Mike, when they're running heroin, when USAID is using CIA planes to run heroin to Vietnam, they're selling them to American soldiers. Yeah? Is it like they're
Absolutely.
they're running heroin to get our own American service members addicted to heroin? Much like the poppy sales in Afghanistan are being used for opioids here in the States to destroy lives. Is this correct?
Right. Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
This whole CIA drug running operation started with the U.S. War Department back in the 1930s, before it was even called the Defense Department, and it renamed from the Department of War to the Department of Defense, just to make it look like, we're forward defending ourselves. We're not declaring war on Iraq or Afghanistan. We're not going to war in Vietnam. We're forward defending our interests. But that was originally done through the OSS and through the War Department when they were using military airlines in the 1930s in China, when we were supporting Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists against the Chinese communists. We were doing that same strategy. They didn't invent that in Cambodia and Vietnam. This is part of the deep interlinkages here, actually, between the same cast of characters who were running the CIA at the time. This is James Jesus Angleton, who was the head of CIA counterintelligence and whose name is all over these documents. He's sort of a lead suspect in the CIA role in the JFK assassination. James Jesus Angleton, he grew up in Italy. Italy was the first place that the CIA launched its political covert action arm in. The State Department got the idea to use the CIA for political dirty work in 1948. In April 1948, its first political job that it was assigned was rigging the 1948 Italy election to swing it towards the pro-West, pro-America candidate over the pro-Russia communist candidate. NSC 10-2 was created just 2 months later. That's the National Security Council memo. Again, back to this NSC versus CIA, power struggle. Again, NSC is the White House, so you can just think of it when you hear NSC now. Just think Trump. It's so NSC versus CIA today is Trump versus CIA, and so the CIA got its plausible deniability cloak in a memo in 1948 called NSC 10-2. That's the plausible deniability doctrine. That all was created because the National Security Council was so enthused about the power of the CIA and its successful operation in Italy in 1948. James G. Sangleton comes out of that. He grew up in Italy. He was the son of a sort of diplomat commercial family. His father was deeply involved with the Chamber of Commerce in Italy. So this is back to this sort of commercial interlinkage with CIA and state. We see, by the way, and we should get to this at some point, the role of commercial cover and multinational corporations in CIA work is very interesting in these documents. But James G. Sangleton comes out of that whole milieu from Jump Street. And what I find really, I guess, interesting about this is you have this power struggle between about how to organize authorities, and it got ahead of itself already. Within 13 years, they were already end running those official channels, and that goes back to what we were talking about with CIA drug running. Gets right back to the military, because this is another beast that Elon and Trump are going to have to take on, is that they have not yet really touched the Pentagon in the way that they have tried to touch USAID. That's something that DOGE is doing review over. And I said this on Joe Rogan about a month ago or a month and a half ago, where I said this fight for USAID is going to be on steroids when it comes to reforming the Pentagon, which is $900 billion. But you're going to find the Pentagon when you try to stop these drug networks. Right now we've declared narco cartels as being terrorists. And this was something that the media has been screaming about. We saw that the New York Times came out and said it was a disaster to designate Mexican cartels as terrorists because it could have massive negative economic consequences on U.S. companies who can't avoid doing business with the cartels effectively, both in foreign countries and at the supply chain layer. We saw the U.S. Institute for Peace, which just this week had to have its doors kicked down and its president forcibly removed by federal police because he refused to resign. Because now this institution, I should note, and this relates to the drug networks, because this is preview. Let me just, open up the crystal ball and just tell you what's going to happen over the next 6 to 12 months here as we continue to do this reorganization. Is you are going to find elements in the Pentagon who do not want to stop the drug cartels. You're going to find elements in the CIA who are not going to want to stop the drug cartels, elements at state, and many, many elements within the NGO layer who are going to continue to get State Department funding or lobby for it. We're going to continue to get legacy USAID funding, who are going to be trying to stop the shutdown of the drug networks. And so I want to sort of paint the picture of how far back this goes. Do you want me to pause or stop or interrupt me at any time? I'm just...
No, I fell into a fit of laughter when the director of the Institute of Peace was fighting like a rabid animal, kicking and biting in order to stop DOGE from entering his building. I think that's very peaceful, and I love it. And it's one of my favorite stories of the week, and we haven't been able to cover it enough. But yes, nonetheless, Mike, please, the table is yours to explain how the U.S. government traffics most of the world's drugs.
Yes. Okay. So the U.S. Institute for Peace was set up in 1984, conveniently, as by congressional mandate the same way that after after JFK established USAID, there was a congressional approval of it. Same thing with the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created by President Ronald Reagan, but then was ratified in a bill in Congress. So U.S. Institute of Peace is the same way. Now, I walked by the U.S. Institute of Peace every day on the way to work because it's right next to the State Department. It's effectively a State Department auxiliary. It's literally the building next door. You can't miss it. It gets $56 million a year from taxpayers through a State Department allocation. It is fully funded by the U.S. government. It was created by the U.S. government. It is an arm of the State Department. There's no two ways about it. They resisted DOGE oversight. They refused to comply with the Trump executive order on establishing DOGE oversight. They fought tooth and nail. They actually kept one of the Trump-appointed U.S. Institute of Peace board members out of the building. They refused to allow one of the board members into the building. I mean, this is someone who was appointed to serve on the board and is not even allowed in the building. Now, if you pull up, I believe this should still be on their website. If you go into Google and you just type U.S. Institute of Peace, Afghanistan, negative economic consequences. I don't think they used the word heroin. I think they used the word poppy. But they wrote a piece, and I can send you a link if they've taken this article down in the past 2 weeks, because I know that folks there are very unhappy with me publicizing this. Let me go. Yeah. Oh, a second.
Oh, wait. Did they take it down?
Yeah. Let me. Don't you worry. I've got just the.
Okay. There you can see the titles that are still there.
Well, it's even better. Let me use Institute.
What the Taliban poppy ban means for Afghan poverty.
Okay, so here you go. So here you go. I have this.
Perfect.
I'm sure they deleted this when this got millions of views this week, but here you go. I just texted it to you, and I'll text it to your producer as well.
I think it's been scrubbed.
Yes. Well, I don't doubt that. Basically, everything I talk about gets scrubbed. Within weeks and months. The National Endowment for Democracy scrubbed. The International Republican Institute scrubbed. Arizona State University scrubbed. The Department of Homeland Security scrubbed. So this is June 2023. Okay, this is not ancient history, Benny. This is a year and a half ago. The Taliban's successful opium ban is bad for Afghans and the world. Mm-hmm. It will have negative economic and humanitarian consequences. So, if you remember, the Taliban tried to shut down opium production in Afghanistan in 2000, 1 year before 9/11, and we then promptly invaded Afghanistan, whereupon Afghanistan went from being 0% of the world's heroin supply to 95% of the world's heroin supply. And the entire thing happened under literal U.S. military occupation. Okay. Now, Afghanistan back in the day in the 1970s was a huge percentage of the world's heroin supply. And I want to kind of go through the history of this from China and the Golden Triangle into the Golden Crescent and into and then finally into the Western Hemisphere, because you're going to see this USAID, CIA, DOD drug running operation that's been going on for 100 years at this point. Everyone can look up a man named Paul Helliwell. Paul Helliwell was the chief legal eagle for the Central Intelligence Agency from the 1930s until the early 1950s. Whereupon he transitioned back into corporate law life. This is another sort of funny intersection. I'm something of a corporate lawyer myself. I worked for 8 years as a New York corporate lawyer, and it's funny when you look at the fact that Alan Dulles and Paul Helliwell and so many of these others were had the same job, because what it has to do is creative structuring in order to hide what's really going on. So Paul Helliwell, you'll see he joined the CIA in 1947. He in May 1949, met with Harry Truman and advocated for increased funds for Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang army there. Now you notice that in the war with China. Now, and Frank Wisner is the guy who created Operation Mockingbird. He's the one who ran Wisner's Wurlitzer, the international swirl of media under the CIA's command that is now stationed out of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, another agency that was just shut down by the Trump administration. That's where Voice of America is now housed out of, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Now, you'll see that this also includes establishing Civil Air Transport, which was the CIA proprietary airliner. Now, what Paul Helliwell is famous for today is he was sort of the architect of the CIA drug running apparatus he basically took it over, because you saw that he formerly worked for the military and then he was CIA. And what Paul Helliwell did is he helped orchestrate this interlinkage between CIA and banks and military cargo planes to run drugs for the KMT by taking the opium that was grown in China and in the Golden Triangle, flying it out on U.S. military aircraft, and then washing the money through several offshore bank accounts effectively. At the time, the Vatican Bank was one of the big games in town in this. The Vatican Bank had worked closely with the U.S. military during World War II when the Vatican Bank and organized crime in Italy were two allies of the U.S. because they were both staunchly against Mussolini. Mussolini was oppressing the Catholic Church. Mussolini was cracking down on Italian mafia organizations and organized crime. And so they were organized crime for the good guys, the mafia was during World War II. And the Vatican Bank was a sovereign banking territory. This is before the Brits perfected offshore banking. And the Brits didn't really move into Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands and Bank of Jersey and all these offshore bank accounts until really the 1950s with the Suez Crisis. So at the time, the Vatican Bank was being used to launder drug proceeds for the U.S. military and the early Central Intelligence Agency. They also diversified the bank accounts into what are now known as CI proprietary banks. If you look up, for example, Castle Bank and Trust or the Nugan Hand Bank, Castle Bank and Trust was set up in the Cayman Islands. Nugan Hand was set up in Australia. In Australia, it was local to Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, and so it was easy. You have these local banks that are set up by the CIA to launder drug proceeds. In the 1970s, this was done with a bank called BCCI, the Bank of Commerce and Credit International, which was a big scandal. It was a CIA proprietary bank that collapsed. It was run out of Pakistan, which, as you and I have talked about, is the sort of star player in the Ryan Routh story. These CIA-Pakistan relations. Now, BCCI was used to launder the heroin proceeds that were being used to fund the Mujahideen, just as the opium proceeds were being used by the CIA and the U.S. military to fund Chiang Kai-shek during the 1930s and 40s against Mao. And just like the cocaine trade was used to help the Nicaraguan Contras and the Brazil military coup and the coups in Bolivia and Argentina and Colombia. So what you see is that narcotics provides 7 to 8 times as much funding for U.S. proxy wars as U.S. development funds do. And so if you try to shut down the drug trade, you are going to shut down the U.S. ability to orchestrate regime change in Venezuela, to orchestrate regime change in Syria. And we saw, for example, these same Syrian terrorist groups, these ISIS groups, they traffic in the drug trade. And lo and behold, where are they sourcing those drugs from? Military, U.S. military occupied poppy crops. USAID was actually busted irrigating the heroin crops, the poppy crops, in order to allow the CIA and its proxy groups to traffic it out of there. And what you see is U.S. Institute for Peace was saying it was going to be a economic and humanitarian disaster if we shut down the drug trade. What happened when Bukele tried to shut down the drug gangs in El Salvador? Who was his enemy there? It was USAID, and it was State Department USAID partners like the George Soros Open Society Foundation, who said, you can't arrest the drug cartels. That's a humanitarian crisis to try to mass incarcerate these drug dealers. Hey, Benny, what are the Soros DAs doing in major metropolitan cities like Chicago and in Arizona and in Los Angeles, where they are literally retailing the drugs that come in from Colombia and Mexico? They're letting the drug dealers go. They are decriminalizing, drug sales. They are keeping the entire layer of the drug trade flowing. And what you see is it goes all the way up to the State Department, the DOD, CIA, and USAID. And so this is just a massive fight that Trump has ahead of him if he wants to try to shut down fentanyl and illegal narcotics, because he's up against his own government.
Whew, Mike, there's so many follow-up questions. I just like sitting back and listening to the lecture, quite frankly. I don't even know where to begin. So I think I'll change the subject, to be quite honest with you.
Okay.
I think you've established just a perfect through line from the creation of the blob. I need it to my window, please, Klein. From the creation of the blob and its inception, which is what we actually see in these documents, which is very fascinating, and then with the through line of the battles that we're having today. And I want to do that with this document. Something that you mentioned before, bioweapons being used, and in particular, to be masked that would appear to be of natural origin. You can see it, right?
I love this one.
Hot damn, man. Where had I seen that before? It's incredible. We'll create a bioweapon for regime change, and we'll loose it, and we'll claim that it was from natural origin, and we'll send Dr. Fauci to the CIA to strong arm and to badger the CIA scientists to say that it came from a Wuhan bat soup. And it's incredible.
$15 million from USAID, by the way. The Wuhan Institute of Virology got $15 million to develop SARS, the fern cleavage site. DARPA developed, coronavirus, jumping animals to humans. They got $15 million from USAID to do that work. So again, USAID, CIA, but
it's refreshing. It's like having a sip of hot tea on a cold winter's night. It's so nice to just see something so familiar here. Let's make sure that it's a biological weapon, but that we can mask it as natural origin. It's like the same playbook, bro. It's like 60 years. The same playbook. It's unbelievable. You've talked about this before. This is obviously Operation Mongoose. This is in Cuba. But break it down. So seeing a lot of action these days. Weather control, biological weapons, and control back in the 60s.
Yes, I'm going to text you and your producer another thing to pull on screen, but let's stay on this one because they're both connected. So I want to read this full thing here, actually, because like I sort of said when we first started talking, I don't think you should expect to see a smoking gun about who killed JFK in here. Now, there will be circumstantial evidence that will be useful for further investigation, but you're not going to find a CIA cable about the CIA killing Kennedy. But you do see smoking guns on. So actually, if we start with that other one, I'm going to connect it to this in a second. Well, actually, we'll start with this maybe, and then we'll go back to that document. So you do see smoking guns for so many other things that are pertinent to world events that are in these documents. And what you just pulled up is an absolutely devastating smoking gun, which corroborates the entire thesis and actual logistical descriptions that are given out in. So if I can just read that quickly, the tweet description, because it just sort of tees it up. And I tweeted this a year and a half ago, And I said, okay, so look, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it looks like COVID may have actually been made in the same military lab where the Pentagon created Lyme disease. And what I mean by that is there's a book by Chris Newby called Bitten, and there's a lot of other excellent researchers who have studied the military origins of tick-borne viruses like Lyme disease, which have a very, very strange imprint on the human nervous system. It's a very unnatural outlier in the realm of human diseases, and it was the U.S. military during the exact period that what you just pulled up on screen was working, had formal military programs to create what we now know as Lyme disease, tick-borne viruses to be deployed on Cuba in order to kill their agriculture crops. So here's the through line here. If you pull up that first screenshot there, you'll see it. This is from Daily Mail. It says revealed. Tony Fauci run lab in Montana experimented with coronavirus strain shipped in from Wuhan a year before COVID pandemic began. Now, what they were doing, now you'll see in the bottom left, that's called the Rocky Mountain Laboratories. Now, this is the star player in Chris Newby's book Bitten about the origins of Lyme disease. The world's foremost expert on tick-borne viruses was recruited to a military lab in Montana called Rocky Mountain Laboratories, where they were given DARPA grants and U.S. military funding to jump tick-borne viruses to humans and to super juice, to basically give Lyme disease and related tick-borne viruses to ticks. They would collect ticks in the Rocky Mountains of Montana, and they would bring them to the lab, and the military would infuse them with what they called sublethal agents, so that it would not cause mass death. This was actually conceived by the military as being a humanitarian way of doing war, because it would not result in hundreds of thousands or millions of casualties. It would just mean all of the agricultural crop workers in Cuba would get sick. They'd get sick for months. They would be lethargic. They'd be unable to do physical labor, which is, by the way, is the same symptoms you have from Lyme disease. And so they would not be able to sustain themselves while they were under a trade embargo from the U.S. The U.S. had a naval blockade on Cuba, so they could not import. They had to rely on their own sugar. They had to rely on their own fruit. And so if you don't have tens of thousands of agricultural crop workers, because nominally commercial airplanes dropping military cargo carrying tick-borne viruses infects the whole agricultural crop workers, now everyone starves. And there has been decades of research on the role of starvation in regime change. It is extremely useful to get people up on the streets to protest their government when the government can't feed the people. There is a pressing time clock because people's family, their children are starving, their wives are starving, so they need, if they believe that the U.S. government, that they'll be able to feed themselves under a new government, or that there will be aid packages delivered with a new government, they will take to the streets and overthrow that government. This is what the military planned to do in Cuba, and they plan to use Lyme disease, created in the first place by the military, to do it. So if you go to the next slides here, you'll see, maybe the next one, right? You'll see here. So this is Bergdorfer, grew up in Basel, Switzerland. Studied at the Swiss Tropical Public Health. At the end of his training in 1951, he took up the position at the U.S. government's Rocky Mountain Labs in Montana. And the job was to try to create, this was done under the cover of trying to create vaccines against these tick-borne viruses. Vaccine diplomacy goes back a long way. In fact, vaccine diplomacy and vaccines as an instrument of statecraft, as a foreign policy tool, was lauded by Henry Kissinger, whose name is all over these documents, as well as by Peter Hotez. Peter Hotez, the star spokesman of all things COVID orthodoxy, wrote a whole series of articles beginning in 2004 about how vaccines can play even if they don't work, even if you leave aside the health benefits, it allows the U.S. State Department to penetrate areas that would typically be forbidden under statecraft and typical intelligence grounds if you run it through the public health facilities and vaccine clinics. As you and I have talked about, the CIA was busted running fake vaccine clinics in Pakistan and running CIA operations in Latin America out of HIV clinics. And so if you go back now to the slide that you had just pulled up, the now declassified, unbracketed. It's like when Trump said, "I'm unshackled," right? Remember when the pussy tape dropped in the 2016 campaign election, he said, "I'm now unshackled." I can say we're now unbracketed. We're unbracketed, Benny. So if you scroll up to the top, I just want to read this whole thing and just tie it together if we have time. So the special group then turns its discussion to agricultural sabotage. Again, the same thing that Chris Newby meticulously documents that was the purpose of creating these tick-borne viruses that would later become what we now live with today as Lyme disease. And you'll notice it's being run at the military level. General Carter. Now, again, the military was funding the creation of these tick-borne viruses out of the very lab that the DARPA grants to create the SARS-CoV-2 fern cleavage sites would be used. The same lab, Benny. It's not like just the same playbook. It's the same players from 60 years ago. Emphasized the extreme sensitivity of any such operation, agricultural sabotage, and that disastrous results would flow from something going wrong. Disastrous results would flow from something going wrong. Oh, like, for example, now Americans are getting Lyme disease, particularly if there were obvious attribution to the U.S. Now, what have I been talking about since Jump Street about who was in control of censorship, about U.S. or U.S. military role in the creation of COVID? It was CIA proprietaries and U.S. military-funded censorship organizations who were the first people on the scene to censor COVID-19. It was the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, which is funded by the U.S. government and has 7 CIA directors on its board, who immediately, before it even got its name, COVID-19, back when it was called the coronavirus, in its first 2 months, was setting up special monitoring groups about rumors of it being man-made or it being a military creation. It was Graphica, who got $7 million in military PSYOP funding. They were literally incubated in the Minerva Initiative, which, thank God, Trump has now shut down, much to the dismay of the censorship industry. The Minerva Initiative is now on its way out the door because its funding has been pulled. They were the ones who incubated Graphica. Graphica was a private corporation that was folded into the Pentagon's Psychological Operations Research Center. They then turned around and began monitoring rumors and actually doing detailed, complex, sophisticated topographical network maps of everyone in the United States, everyone in every NATO country, everyone in Southeast Asia, everyone in South America, by political party, by communal affiliation. Who were the major networks spreading those conspiracy theories about there being man-made origins? And they started doing that in December and January, December 2019 and January 2020. So you'll see the military is saying operationally, we need to do this. We need to make sure no one thinks it's us. During COVID, DARPA funded the creation of these fern cleavage site SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus viruses, and then funded the cover-up of it. He went on to say, however, that it would be possible to accomplish this purpose by methods more subtle than those indicated in the paper. Now, what I want to know is, show me the paper. What's in that paper? Because the nice thing about this is these documents also provide, there's a lot of references to annexes that we don't have. There's a lot of references to, cited documents that are not in this. I want to know, what's in that paper. He mentioned specifically the possibility of producing crop failures by the introduction of biological agents which would appear to be of natural origin. That's what they were doing with Lyme disease. That's what they were doing with tick-borne viruses that were being created for the express purpose of dropping them into Cuba. Now, what we don't have is evidence that it was actually dropped into Cuba. We don't know whether or not they actually went through with this. What we do know is that that work was then carried out in Lyme, in Lyme, Connecticut, where in that whole New York Lyme, just like, for example, in that Montana lab, would then carry out its work at the UNC Chapel Hill lab. There's this interlinkage here. That's we got EcoHealth Alliance and the USAID funding. Mr. Bundy said he had worries about any such sabotage which could clearly be made to appear as the result of local Cuban disaffection or of a natural disaster, but that we must avoid external activities such as the release of chemicals unless they could be completely covered up. So, and again, part of the reason they started running this outside of the National Security Council, part of the reason this became run completely in-house at USAID was because Dulles, the CIA director, and folks within the National Security Council did not want things to be run through the traditional NSC machinery, because all it takes is one whistleblower. Trump leaves office and writes a book and says, holy crap, I was in the meeting where we decided we were going to unleash biological agents to destabilize the world economy to ensure that Trump wouldn't be reelected. And we worked with our partners in China who also hated Trump to do it. But if the CIA hated Trump as they did, as the military hated Trump as they did, and I can personally attest that Trump, was at war with his own generals from within his White House. We know that Mark Milley, for example, was having close calls with China behind Trump's back to reassure China that Trump would not be taking action, during the transition period. And Mark Milley was very close to the China folks there. Were they close during the Wuhan lab, thing here? Did they run this through the Wuhan? Did they run this DARPA-created, USAID-funded operation through a Chinese lab so that the U.S. involvement could be, quote, completely covered up? Because China's got tight controls over its own information security. What I'm saying is all of this opens the door to further declassification, and it helps us forensically reconstruct the specific institutions which now need much further review, from the AFL-CIO to the public health universities to USAID itself.
So very quickly, Mike, because
Robert Mayer.
Utterly fascinating. This went viral. It was a post from Eric Weinstein, and he's getting into the Epstein op, which is the way that I read this. But I don't know, right? Like, here's a world leader, here's a actress or young girl, and here's a film of it. And we've sent those naughty films to the state that we wish to influence. And it's all here in black and white. And I'm sure that you know far more about this operation. But to me, much like the poisoning of crops and the natural origin and the bioweapons, it sure as hell seems to rhyme with what we know about the Epstein op. Your take on these notes from inside of the JFK documents release.
Oh, I have been skeptical for some time about the blackmail. To me, it's obvious that Epstein was an access agent. That to me is fairly incontrovertible. Now, an access agent is someone who gets access to networks or to geographic or physical territories that you would not normally be able to get access to as a diplomat. And so you need some sort of intelligence asset under some sort of cover, humanitarian cover, emergency worker cover, commercial cover, embassy cover, but that can hobnob with individuals and get them to share secrets, get them to tell you their plans of what they're going to be doing next. Be in the room where it happens. For example, if people are using, freshly issued burner phones, the NSC can't tap that immediately unless they are able to, have a network that they can immediately tie it into. Oftentimes, you just need people on the ground. And the fact is Epstein was more connected than anyone I've ever heard of, other than diplomats like Henry Kissinger and the like. This is a guy who was in with not just heads of state like, Bill Clinton or Ehud Barak in Israel, or Netanyahu in Israel, or the British royal family in the UK, but it was in, having frequent meetings with Bill Gates and Reid Hoffman, who was deeply involved in the universities. He was one of the key funders of the MIT Media Lab. MIT, by the way, is all over these CIA documents, which is a whole other thing, the CIA and the universities in this. He had connections in Hollywood. He had, obviously, these connections to these sex trafficking rings. Now, the CIA was involved in sex trafficking. Again, so was the War Department, actually was in the 1930s and 40s for intel collection during World War II. You have these soldiers in these brothels. You see the military and CIA role in prostitution is a very interesting one. But the CIA was famously running something at this very time while this is going on called Operation Midnight Climax. You can look that up. There's been a lot of movies and books written about this, which was the CIA's work with whorehouses, not just abroad, but in the United States itself. The CIA was effectively running brothels in New York and in Los Angeles and in San Francisco. We know that there have been strange cases of high-level political figures being involved in, with the DC Madam and these other sort of prostitution scandals that happened. If you want to get rid of a prosecutor, for example, this is what, prostitution was used to take down folks like Elliot Spitzer in New York. You can gather a lot of intelligence by capitalizing on people's vices. And what you see here with the Robert Mayhew story is, what seems to be an almost direct replica of Jeffrey Epstein,
Yes.
except we know with Robert Mayhew belonged to intelligence, and we know that Jeffrey Epstein belonged to intelligence,
Yes.
because the friggin' prosecutor himself, Alex Acosta, when he was appointed to be the Secretary of Labor, when he was nominated to be the appointee, one of the big scandals was, well, why didn't you crack down on Epstein? Because he had just gotten rearrested. And Alex Acosta came out and publicly, put the chips on the table and said, wasn't my fault. I, at the Justice Department, was told to back off of Epstein because he belonged to intelligence. And I have also seen a lot of other things with CIA Epstein that show a direct communication channel there. But let me pause that to say that you also have these strange situations. If you go to Google right now and you type in Jeffrey Epstein, New York State Department, State Department lease, and you'll see something, because again, anytime you have these CIA operations, they're supposed to be State Department approval. And so you have now Alex Acosta. Here you go. Look at that just pull up that BuzzFeed one. Okay. Now, let me mention just a little bit of the history of Jeffrey Epstein and statecraft, because the question is was Jeffrey Epstein Robert Mayhew 50 years later, 40 years later, 30 years later, actually, because the Jeffrey Epstein story goes back to 1985 and potentially earlier. Jeffrey Epstein was involved in actually, before I read this, let me set the stage here. So maybe if you can scroll if you like, but I'll come back to it. Jeffrey Epstein was involved in several CIA adjacent operations long before the sex trafficking allegations came to pass. And again, we know that the prosecutor prosecuting Epstein said that he was intelligence, which is going to mean CIA. Now, it likely also means foreign intelligence organizations. It's very difficult for me to imagine, for example, that it was not, if I believe that Epstein was an access agent. I also believe that it's highly likely that it was a shared access agent between the US, the UK, and Israel. You simply, the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, was a Mossad agent, the fact that you have these deep interlinkages with the Israeli government, the fact that the CIA itself has these deep interlinkages. We see these in the documents. James Jesus Angleton was the guy who ran point for U.S.-Israel intelligence sharing in back channels. Anytime you have U.S. intelligence, you have British intelligence. There's a special relationship between the U.S. and U.K. There's a special relationship between the U.K. and Israel. If you remember, Israel only got its independence, only got created as a country because of the Balfour Declaration. The letter from Lord Rothschild to Lord Balfour during World War II about basically securing the British mandate of Palestine for Israel. So there's been this joint fluidity between the U.S., U.K., and Israel. The fact that Epstein runs through the intelligence networks of all three leads me to believe that part of the sensitivity around Epstein disclosures is that it's not just an in-house thing vis-a-vis U.S. intelligence. We saw this, for example, in a sense that's controversial and a major scandal that Americans can't even get disclosure about their own paid for by American taxpayers intelligence work. But this is not just unique to Israel. You see in these documents, the Australian embassy was putting pressure on the CIA not to declassify various things. You saw many other countries whose names were redacted until just 2 days ago, in Belize, in Guatemala, in Mexico, in Hungary. So this is not just a Israel or UK thing. This is a fairly common thing. You can imagine, for example, if the UK wanted to declassify, if Joe Biden was in power and Nigel Farage had won the campaign to become the prime minister of the UK, you could imagine the Joe Biden State Department and CIA putting pressure not to declassify British intelligence documents that implicated U.S. access agents, because there's joint intelligence sharing through Five Eyes and other channels. What I'm saying, though, here is the Jeffrey Epstein story runs through statecraft, not just through the sex trafficking ring, but for coming up on 40 years now. In 1985, Jeffrey Epstein was involved in these intelligence networks during the Iran-Contra affair. It was Jeffrey Epstein and his sponsor Les Wexner in Columbus, Ohio, who played a large role in this in the Iran-Contra scandal when Congress forbade the Republican. You had a Democrat Congress who passed something called the Bolin Amendment, which prevented U.S. taxpayer funds from being used for regime change in Nicaragua. But the Reagan White House wanted to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua anyway. The problem was they were not allowed to use taxpayer dollars to do it. So they had to get creative. They had to create what the National Security Council point on this, Poindexter, would call a standalone, self-sustained, off-the-shelf private enterprise to run this. So it was being coordinated by the government, but the funding would be done through something they called the enterprise, which would be private. It would be standalone, meaning it would not be stood up within the government. It would be self-sustained, meaning it would fund itself. And it would be off the shelf, meaning the U.S. government could pick it up or put it down when it needed it for black ops and dirty work operations when it needed and when it didn't need it. They would call it off the shelf or a la carte. It would exist as a network node to be utilized when and as needed, but it wouldn't be a permanent government function. It wouldn't be like a Bureau of Political Affairs subsection at state or at DOD or CIA. And they created this for Iran-Contra. This all came out in public hearings. It was a massive scandal during the Reagan administration. It ran through George H.W. Bush, who was the CIA director and whose name is all over these JFK documents, I should note, which is another interesting thread. But maybe we'll get to that maybe in another venue. But Jeffrey Epstein was involved in the personal negotiation. So those CIA airliners to run drugs to the Nicaraguan Contras, because they couldn't fund it through, congressional allocations. They funded it through drugs. The cocaine trade, the Nicaraguan Contras were effectively running a drug trade through Miami, through Mena, Arkansas, and the CIA air base there under Bill Clinton's control. Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas at the time. This was a massive scandal that the CIA air base was being used to run drugs under a Democrat governor for a Republican president. Of course, that governor would become the next president. Funny that, right? But Jeffrey Epstein, the airlines that were being used for that were by and large CIA proprietary airlines like Air America, Southern Air Transport, Continental Air Services. They weren't running this on like, Delta flights. These were CIA proprietaries that were trafficking drugs from CIA air bases to their friendly points of contact in Colombia and transporting in from there, or Guatemala or Costa Rica, or directly into Nicaragua. And that was Jeffrey Epstein was involved in the personal renegotiation when the Mena Air Force Base closed down, and when the Southern Air Transport was closed down in Miami. Those bases moved directly to Columbus, Ohio, which is the home of Jeffrey Epstein's sponsor, Les Wexner. I believe it's also where Vivek comes from. And I'm not implicating Vivek here. I'm trying to say that there's a fascinating role of economic development and military CIA activity. And Columbus, Ohio was also the star of the show, if you remember, with the Haiti kerfuffle, when Haitians were being moved en masse into Republican Mike DeWine's state of Ohio to Springfield, just like 15, 20 minutes away from Columbus, Ohio. Now, Columbus, Ohio was Republicans were apoplectic. Do you remember this scandal? This was about 6 months ago.
Oh, of course.
And what was happening there is Mike DeWine was in the process of turning Ohio into a major military industrial hub. This is part of his economic development plan, is to supercharge Ohio's military contracts. Now Columbus, Ohio, that exact region they were being imported to, was exactly where the CIA proprietary airline that Jeffrey Epstein negotiated. They literally closed down in Miami and Mena, moved to Columbus, Ohio. They then used that for transport to Hong Kong, which is a major drug trafficking hub. Hong Kong was won over by the British by military means during the Opium Wars in the 1800s. Again, the Hong Kong only became a non-China entity. The reason there's a dispute over Hong Kong is because it was seized by the British when China refused to buy British opium. We call these the Opium Wars. And so Hong Kong was a narco state, just like Taiwan, just like what's now Colombia, and what Afghanistan was turned into, what Pakistan is. And so what I'm getting at here is Jeffrey Epstein was taking these CIA drug running airliners and moving them directly to Columbus, Ohio. Remember the Haitians, okay? Why were the Haitians being brought into Ohio? What does that have to do with Jeffrey Epstein and Les Wexner and the U.S. military? Well, if you remember, we recently, FBI informants, DEA informants, and U.S. military-funded commandos assassinated the president of Haiti in 2021. You can look this up. It's an incredible scandal that's currently playing out completely behind closed doors because the CIA intervened on the trial of the Haitian, the FBI informant, DEA informant, and U.S. military-trained assassin squad. They've been on trial in Miami for the past several years, but the CIA intervened on the Justice Department and said that sensitive information about these individuals cannot be turned over to defense counsel. You cannot have open hearings. You can't sit in or read the transcripts of these trials because it's a matter of national security about whether or not these people who assassinated the president of Haiti, it could undermine U.S. national security if we knew the details of who killed the president of Haiti. What does that tell you? But Haiti is also their main export is apparel. Okay, most of the workforce in Haiti either works in one of two fields. They either do apparel, where they the threads, the t-shirts, skirts, luxury fashion, high-end dresses, lingerie. Most of a huge proportion of that is centered in Haiti. There's cheap labor. There's no look oversight from the regulatory authorities. Bill Clinton couped the Haitian president Aristide out of power in the early 90s, and then couped him back into power in the late 1990s. This is how much the Clinton world has been playing around in Haiti. But Jeffrey Epstein's chief sponsor, the guy who gave him his second New York townhouse, which will get us back to this article, because his first New York townhouse was given to him directly by the U.S. State Department. How do you get that, by the way? Try just walking up to the State Department and trying to make them your landlord. But Jeffrey Epstein, so what I'm trying to say is Limited Brands made its goods in Haiti. Okay, Columbus, Ohio, the Limited Brands was the largest retailer in the United States in the 1990s, centered out of Columbus, Ohio, sourcing its goods out of Haiti. Okay, that whole financial empire, it's like straight out of Zoolander. When the whole plot of Zoolander was to assassinate the Malaysian prime minister in order so that high-end apparel in New York City could keep sourcing its goods from Malaysia, and they wouldn't implement these child labor laws. Well, we just assassinated the president of Haiti. Jeffrey Epstein's main sponsor, Les Wexner, runs his whole network out of Columbus, Ohio. The whole thing runs on the fashion industry in Haiti. We were just importing tens of thousands of Haitians directly into the area while we are trying to stabilize the government. The whole purpose of these refugee programs is to give them free food, free housing, free cars, no-show jobs, so that we pay for their entire lifestyle so that they can send our taxpayer money in the form of remittances to CIA-backed mercenary groups in the area to take control. That's the whole game. We pay for everything, so they send remittances back to the network they came from. So you don't even need USAID funding. If Congress doesn't want to approve billions of dollars in USAID funding, no problem, because beyond the development funding, we've got the narco trafficking funds and we've got the remittance money for the refugee programs. It's all being run through the same Columbus, Haiti network that Jeffrey Epstein was running, and even negotiating the CIA airliners to set up the transportation hubs to run it from. I'll pause there to say, oh, okay.
I just say, we'll tighten it up, right? It's the same, right? It's the same operational playbooks. And that's essentially all I'm trying to get to, is whether it's COVID-19 or whether it's Jeffrey Epstein, you can see laid bare here in the documents. It's the same.
Yeah, and it's approved at the highest levels. Jeffrey Epstein leased that $15,000 a month in the 1990s. This is before the famous Jeffrey Epstein townhouse, which is just 2 blocks away. He moved directly from the State Department to that Les Wexner, acquired for $0, largest residential real estate building in the entire city of New York. Okay. Now, Jeffrey Epstein leased that directly from the State Department. The State Department had just seized that building from Iran. They seized it from the government of Iran. Now, remember, I said that Jeffrey Epstein was involved in the gun running networks. He was working with Adnan Khashoggi, and his whole network was the main arms runner for during Iran-Contra. The State Department seizes this giant residential palace from the government of Iran, and then gives it to Jeffrey Epstein, but then gets double-crossed by Epstein when Epstein then subleases the building out without the State Department's consent to, and if you scroll down, you'll see how this ended up falling apart, and he ended up moving to the now famous mansion. Actually, if you scroll up 1 second, it's just right above you. But things went sour when the State Department sued Epstein, alleging that he moved out of the building without their consent. This is another thing they freaked out about, is when he left and they didn't know where he was. But then he ended up subletting it to Ivan Fisher, the famous New York criminal defense lawyer who represented the French Connection and Pizza Connection drug rings. Now, the French Connection was the CIA. This is, there's a whole movie about this called The French Connection. So let me explain the French Connection, Pizza Connection here. The French Connection was, so when the CIA was moving opium out of the Golden Triangle and moving it into Vatican Bank accounts and Cayman Islands accounts and offshore CIA proprietary banks, they were processing the refinement of the opium into heroin and the processing of the narcotics in France. The French CIA facilities were used to process the drugs. They were then transported to Italy, where the unions and the Italian mafia organizations would then transport them out through the Mediterranean and into ports in New York and in Boston and in Miami. So you had the CIA and military sourcing the drugs. You had the French CIA military connection that was refining it, and you had the Italians who were moving it logistically through their unions, through the dock workers, through the ship workers, and through the transport that was controlled by the unions, which was controlled by the mob, which was answering to and protected by. This is why these organized crime networks were never arrested until the 1990s, when we basically moved primarily from the Italian mobs to the Colombian and the Mexican and the Central Asian ones, with the Turkish White Wolves and the whole Taliban ISIS networks. But basically, they were protected for 50 years by the Justice Department because they belonged to intelligence. But what I'm saying is Jeffrey Epstein not only scored this cushy mansion directly from the State Department in a region Epstein himself helped facilitate the arms traffic to, but then he subleased it out to the guy representing the defendants in the exact drug running operations that the CIA was running. Now, the pizza connection, by the way, is not the John Podesta, Hillary Clinton Pizzagate networks. This was a separate scandal that popped off in the 1980s when the Italian mafia was laundering drug proceeds through cash-only pizza parlors up and down the East Coast. And this went protected for decades, and everyone wondered, why aren't the prosecutors doing anything? And the answer was because they were moving the wholesale products from the intelligence services that were being used to fund proxy wars when we couldn't get enough USAID funding, and washing it through pizza parlors. What's the answer to that? Give more USAID funding. And so this is one of the funny things about all these USAID-funded groups saying, don't get rid of USAID. It's going to cause these negative economic and humanitarian consequences, because the more you strip USAID, the more CIA drug trafficking you need.
Mike, it's like interviewing Grok. This is what it is like. It's like interviewing the most sophisticated AI that understands the deepest, darkest secrets of our federal government. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want to understand those secrets, and I have more follow-up questions. Every time I think I have a follow-up question, we bulldoze that like 7 stories ago and like keep going. You got to follow Mike. Here's Mike's account. Like, it's in document dumps like these, we can barely crack the crust, and Mike goes like straight to the very heart. This has been like listening to a college lecture, Mike. It's amazing. And we encourage, Mike does a lot of this actually on his channel. 1 million.
I'll be doing a 4-hour lecture tonight, actually, on X.
1 million subs. Mike, I might regret this, but here we go. In 60 seconds or less, who killed Kennedy?
I have thoughts. I think the beautiful thing about these documents is that they give us leads to try to secure that answer. Like I said, these are paper documents, and that paper's been sitting around for 60 years. With the Whitey Bulger case in 2014, under the Obama administration, of course, Whitey Bulger's cousin is close with Joe Biden, but you had the FBI, talking about the need to destroy its own paper records, because if anyone finds this, we'll all get fired. That was a direct quote from this special agent in charge of the FBI field office in Boston, about Whitey Bulger in the early 2010s. So I have to think that, given that the CIA was turned over, to the administration, they're not going to put that on paper. But what you can do is you can build a case, as was done by the New Orleans prosecutor in the 1970s. The best you can do is reconstruct the full picture before you make a preliminary assessment. Obviously, there's a lot of people, these documents give a list of suspects, but it's almost like a game of Clue, where everybody involved has the means and the motives. Whether you think that's the CIA, whether you think it's a foreign intelligence service, like, people are saying, the Israeli government may be implicated, whether you think it's the unions, whether you think it's the anti-Castro Cubans, whether you think it's his own military brass, who are upset about his détente with Russia and his policy on Cuba. Everybody's got the means and the motive. But the best thing that we can do is, on the way to trying to find that ultimate answer, reconstruct as much of the history of the national security state, declassify all the annexes we just talked about, and the paper references. Those are relevant. Those should be a second tranche. They may have information relevant to who killed Kennedy. And obviously, we should be demanding the same level of transparency about the Epstein releases, because these are the same networks as we just talked about. The CIA role in both of them, the State Department role in both of them, the intelligence web and outside institutions in both of them. So I don't want any brackets in the Epstein releases. This has been a healthy exercise, and it's set the gold standard for subsequent releases. And I am proud to be an American this week.
All right. Beautiful way to end it. Godspeed, Mike. Everybody follow Mike. More lectures tonight. You're the man, dude.
You too.
Talk soon.